the darkness outside your window isn't empty tonight. It's watching, waiting for you to turn your back, to let your guard down, to believe you're truly alone. Tonight, we're exploring the quiet corners of dread, the places where reality frays and the familiar becomes terrifying. Settle in, if you dare. Dim the lights, put on your headphones, and let the outside world fade away. We're about to delve into stories that burrow deep, stories that whisper long after they're over. Each one a chilling reminder that some fears are best left undisturbed, but tonight, we're disturbing them all. The curtains in Maya's bedroom were always a little too thin, letting in the orange glow from the streetlights, even on the darkest nights. I remember thinking it was an odd detail for a house that otherwise felt so incredibly normal. This was back when I was about 13, and sleepovers were still the absolute peak of social events. Maya lived a few streets over from me in the kind of quiet, tree-lined suburban neighborhood where nothing ever really happened. Her parents were out of town that weekend, a rare occurrence. We'd finished our second movie, a cheesy horror flick that hadn't even managed to make us jump, and decided a snack run was in order. Around 11:30 p.m., we tiptoed down to the kitchen, giggling quietly as we raided the pantry for potato chips and soda. Maya's kitchen had a back door that led to a small, enclosed patio, and beyond that, their backyard. It was usually locked, but as Maya grabbed the last bag of chips, she paused, looking at the door. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her eyes wide. I hadn't heard anything over our rustling and hush talking, just the usual house creaks. I told her it was probably just the wind or the house settling, and we went back upstairs, our arms full of snacks. Back in her room, we spread out our haul on the floor, flipping through channels for something else to watch. That's when I saw it. Just a flicker, really, in the thin gap between the curtains. A shadow, not quite uniform with the usual streetlight glow. It moved, then was gone. I blinked, convinced it was just my imagination, or maybe a car passing by. But Maya had seen it too. She froze, a chip halfway to her mouth. "There it is again," she breathed, pointing a trembling finger. This time, it was slower, more deliberate. A distinct, human-like shadow passing by the window, pausing, then moving on. We both stared at the window, suddenly very quiet, the air in the room turning cold. "It's probably just Mr. Henderson," I tried to rationalize, my voice a little too loud in the sudden silence. Mr. Henderson was their next-door neighbor, an older man who sometimes took late-night walks with his dog. But we hadn't heard a dog, and the shadow had been too tall, too lean to be him. Maya just shook her head, her gaze fixed on the window. We stayed like that for a few minutes, not moving, not speaking. The silence in the house felt heavy, like a blanket pressing down on us. Eventually, I convinced myself it was just the wind playing tricks with the light in a bush, or maybe the reflection of something inside the room. We put another movie on, trying to distract ourselves, but the uneasy feeling lingered. Hours later, around 2 a.m., we were finally dozing off, the movie droning quietly. That's when we both jolted awake. A distinct thud had come from downstairs. It wasn't a house creak, and it wasn't subtle. It sounded like something heavy had been dropped, or like someone had deliberately placed something down. Our eyes met in the dim light. Maya's face was pale. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. I nodded, my heart starting to pound. This wasn't the wind, and it wasn't a shadow playing tricks. This was inside the house. We lay there, completely still, listening. The house was silent again, but it felt different this time. A tense, waiting silence. Then, we heard it. Faint, soft footsteps, coming from downstairs. They weren't heavy, stomping footsteps, these were quiet, deliberate, like someone was trying not to be heard. They moved slowly, from what sounded like the living room, towards the kitchen. Every creak of the floorboards echoed in the stillness of the night. We pulled the covers up to our chins, rigid with fear. I remember thinking about the back door in the kitchen, the one Maya had paused at earlier. Had it been unlocked? Was someone actually in the house? My mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation, but none came. The footsteps stopped in the kitchen, and then we heard a faint clinking sound, like glass on a counter. Maya, ever the quick thinker, silently pointed to the space under her bed. We slid off the bed without a sound, our movements synchronized by pure terror, and squeezed into the narrow space, pulling the duvet over the side of the bed to conceal us. It was dusty and cramped, but it felt like the only safe place. From our hiding spot, we heard the footsteps again, closer now. They were coming up the stairs. Each creak was agonizing, growing louder and louder, until they were right outside Maya's bedroom door. The doorknob slowly, silently, turned. Our breaths hitched in our throats. The door opened, just a crack, letting in a sliver of the hallway light. A silhouette stood in the doorway, tall and still. We couldn't see any details, just the dark outline against the dim hallway light. It didn't move. It just stood there, watching the empty room, for what felt like an eternity. Then, incredibly, it started to hum. A low, tuneless hum, barely audible. It was the kind of sound someone makes when they're bored, or thinking. My blood ran cold. This wasn't a burglar, not acting like one. This was something else. After another agonizing minute, the silhouette moved, closing the door as quietly as it had opened it. We heard the footsteps retreat down the hallway, back down the stairs, and then the faint click of the back door closing. Then, silence. We didn't come out from under the bed until the first rays of sunlight began to filter through the thin curtains. My whole body ached from being cramped in that tiny space. When we finally emerged, Maya immediately went to check the back door. It was locked, just as it should have been. But on the kitchen counter, next to a half-eaten bag of chips we hadn't touched, was a single, neatly stacked pile of all the soda cans we had emptied, along with a small, empty glass. We hadn't used a glass. We'd been drinking straight from the cans. There was no sign of forced entry, nothing stolen. Just those neatly stacked cans and that single glass. We never had another sleepover at Maya's house again. It's a simple game, until it isn't. Until the rules change, and the player you thought you knew reveals something else entirely. Sometimes, the most unsettling things are those that appear ordinary, those that slip into your life without a second glance, only to linger. And sometimes, they don't even need an invitation. The curtains in my new bedroom didn't quite cover the window, leaving a sliver of dark glass exposed to the moonless night. I was 15 that summer, freshly relocated with my family to a small town in upstate New York, and still adjusting to the quiet. My best friend from our old town, Sarah, came to visit a few weeks after we moved in. It was a big deal, our first sleepover in the new house, a chance to finally feel normal again. We'd planned it for weeks, movies, junk food, and staying up talking until the sun came up. The house itself was an older colonial, 2 stories, with a sprawling yard and a couple of those massive, ancient oak trees that always look a little ominous in the dark. Sarah arrived Friday evening, and we immediately set up our sleepover headquarters in my room. My bed was pushed against the wall, and we had a pile of blankets and pillows on the floor next to it, where Sarah would sleep. Around midnight, we decided a snack run was in order. The kitchen was downstairs, through the living room and past the front door. We crept down, giggling, trying not to wake my parents who were already asleep. The house was completely silent, the kind of heavy quiet that only old houses seem to have. We grabbed a bag of chips and some sodas, then tiptoed back up the stairs, careful not to creak any of the old wooden steps. As we passed the living room window on our way back upstairs, I noticed something odd. The small porch light above our front door was on. I remembered distinctly turning it off when we'd gone outside earlier that evening to check for shooting stars. It was a detail so small, so insignificant, that I almost dismissed it. Maybe my dad had flicked it on when he came to bed, I thought, though he never usually did. I mentioned it to Sarah, who just shrugged, already halfway up the stairs, eager to get back to our movie. It was just a light, after all, easily explained away, but something about it felt off. Back in my room, we settled down, munching chips and resuming our movie. A while later, maybe around 2 a.m., I needed to use the bathroom. It was just down the hall. I told Sarah I'd be right back. As I slipped out of my room, I glanced downstairs towards the front door. The porch light was still on, casting a dim glow through the glass panel. But this time, something else caught my eye. Right inside the front door, on the small mat by the shoe rack, there was a pair of men's work boots. They definitely weren't my dad's. His shoes were always neatly lined up in the mudroom. These were muddy, a dark, heavy pair I'd never seen before. My heart started to beat a little faster. I stood still, listening, but the house was silent again. Too silent. I told myself it was probably the previous owner's stuff that my parents just hadn't gotten rid of yet, though it seemed unlikely they'd leave muddy boots. I tried to rationalize it, pushing down the prickle of unease. I used the bathroom quickly, then hurried back towards my room, not wanting to linger in the quiet hallway. Just as I reached my door, I heard it, a faint creak from downstairs. It sounded like someone shifting their weight on the old floorboards in the living room. My breath hitched in my throat. I froze, my hand on my doorknob. The creak was followed by another, softer sound. It was barely audible, like a low murmur. Not a distinct voice, just a sort of soft, rhythmic sound, as if someone was quietly talking to themselves, or perhaps whispering on the phone. My mind raced. My parents were definitely asleep. Sarah was in my room. Who else could be downstairs? The fear was a cold wave, washing over me. I slowly, carefully, opened my bedroom door and slipped inside, making sure to close it as quietly as possible, not even a click. Sarah looked up, oblivious, still engrossed in the movie. I quietly walked over to my bed, trying to appear normal. "Everything okay?" Sarah mumbled, her eyes still on the screen. "Yeah, fine," I whispered back, my voice barely there. I sat on the edge of my bed, my ears strained, listening. The whispering had stopped. Now there was just the hum of the refrigerator from downstairs, and the faint sound of crickets outside. I wanted to tell Sarah, but I also didn't want to freak her out if it was nothing. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a minute or two, trying to convince myself it was just the house settling, or the wind. Then, I heard a very soft click. It sounded like it came from my bedroom door. The one I had just closed. My blood ran cold. I hadn't locked it. I never locked it. I slowly turned my head towards the door. The sliver of light from the hallway, which had been completely blocked by the closed door, was now faintly visible along the hinge side. The door was open, just a fraction of an inch, perhaps half an inch, but it was enough. Enough to know it wasn't fully shut anymore. Enough to know someone had opened it. I stared at that tiny crack of light, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I thought Sarah must hear it. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. I just watched that thin line of light, waiting. The gap didn't widen. It didn't close. It just stayed there, a silent, dark invitation. I couldn't see anything through it, just the dim light of the hall. I imagined an eye, pressed against that crack, watching us. Watching me. The idea paralyzed me. After what felt like an hour, but was likely only a few minutes of intense silence, I heard the faint, slow drag of fabric against carpet. A soft, measured shuffle. It was moving away from my door, down the hall, towards the stairs. I heard the muffled creak of a stair tread, then another, slowly fading. Whoever it was, they were going back downstairs. I didn't move until I heard the faint click of the front door closing. Only then did I scramble off the bed, shaking Sarah awake. We spent the rest of the night huddled together, terrified, listening to the silence. In the morning, we told my parents everything. My dad went downstairs, checked the front door, it was locked, just like we'd left it. The muddy boots were gone. He searched the whole house, inside and out, but found nothing. No forced entry, no broken windows. He even checked the shed and garage. Empty. My parents chalked it up to our imaginations, a new house making us jumpy. But Sarah and I knew what we heard, and what we saw. We knew the door had been opened. We knew those boots hadn't been there before. The most unsettling thing was that there was no explanation, no sign of anyone. Just the memory of a dark presence, a quiet click, and the knowledge that for a few terrifying minutes, someone had been in our house, watching us, and then just left. Sarah went home that afternoon, and I refused to have another sleepover for months. Even now, years later, every time I close a door, I double-check it. Every time I hear a creak in an old house, I feel that cold dread return. My parents eventually installed a deadbolt on my bedroom door, and I always lock it at night. But I still wonder who it was, and why they were there. And sometimes, in the dead of night, I still imagine that sliver of light, and the quiet click that meant someone had been listening, and was just outside my door. The door is closed, and you think you're safe. But the world outside doesn't always stay outside. Some presences don't need a key, or even an opening. They just are. And when you finally see what's truly there, you might realize that the most secure places are often the most vulnerable. What if the lock isn't for them, but for you? The thing about my best friend Sarah's house was that her parents always insisted on locking every single door, inside and out, before going to bed. It was a habit I'd always found a little over the top, even for a quiet suburban street like theirs. That night, though, it wasn't just a weird quirk, it was the first piece of a puzzle I still can't quite fit together. We were maybe 16, and it was just another Friday night sleepover, the kind we'd had 100 times. Movies, junk food, typical teenage stuff. Her parents had said goodnight around 11, and we'd heard the distinct clicks of all the locks engaging around the house, including the one on Sarah's bedroom door, which they always locked from the outside. I'm Mark, by the way. Sarah and I had been inseparable since elementary school. Her house felt like a second home, so I was completely comfortable there. After her parents went to bed, we kept talking, whispering secrets and laughing until well past midnight. Around 1:30 a.m., hunger struck. You know how it is, late-night talks always work up an appetite. We decided on a stealth mission to the kitchen for snacks. We were seasoned pros at this. Sarah always knew the exact floorboards to avoid, how to open the fridge without a squeak, and which cabinets had the good stuff. It was part of the fun of sleepovers, sneaking around in the dark. So, we tiptoed out of Sarah's room. The hallway was pitch black, lit only by the faint glow from the digital clock on her dresser. We were being extra quiet, trying not to wake her parents. As we crept past her parents' closed bedroom door, I heard it. A very soft thud, like something light hitting carpet, from inside their room. Sarah froze, pressing her finger to her lips, her eyes wide. We both stood there, holding our breath, listening. A moment later, we heard it again, a little louder this time, followed by a faint, almost imperceptible dragging sound. It was too quiet to be her dad, who was a pretty heavy sleeper, and too rhythmic to be a pet. My mind immediately jumped to some logical explanation. Maybe her mom had gotten up for a glass of water, or perhaps their old cat, Mittens, had knocked something over. Sarah nodded subtly, as if agreeing with my unspoken thoughts, and we continued our mission to the kitchen. It was silly, really, how much we rationalized it. Anything to avoid admitting that something felt off. We grabbed a bag of chips and some sodas, carefully closing the fridge door, and then started our silent trek back upstairs. The house was completely silent now, the earlier sounds forgotten in our pursuit of late-night snacks. Everything felt normal again, just two teenagers being teenagers. We made it back to Sarah's room without incident, closed the door as quietly as we could, and settled down to eat. We talked about school, about boys, about whatever was on TV. The earlier odd noises were totally out of our minds. But then, as we were winding down, maybe around 3 a.m., I needed to use the bathroom. Sarah's bathroom was across the hall, right next to her parents' bedroom. She nodded, grabbed a small flashlight from her nightstand, and handed it to me. "Be super quiet," she whispered, "and don't forget to lock the door when you come back in." That last part was just typical Sarah, always reminding me about the lock. I opened her bedroom door, stepped out, and gently pulled it shut behind me. As I turned to walk to the bathroom, I heard a very faint, almost musical squeak from the end of the hall. It sounded like a floorboard, but not one I'd ever heard before in this house. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, sweeping across the carpeted hallway, revealing nothing. I paused, listening intently. Nothing. Just the muffled hum of the refrigerator from downstairs. I shrugged it off, probably just the house settling, and made my way to the bathroom. I was in there for only a couple of minutes, trying to be as quick and silent as possible. When I stepped back out into the hall, my flashlight beam landed directly on something that made my stomach drop. Sarah's parents' bedroom door, which had been firmly closed when we went downstairs and when I went into the bathroom, was now open by about an inch. Just enough to see a sliver of darkness inside, darker than the hallway itself. My heart started thudding. This was not right. Her parents always kept that door shut. Always. I stood there, frozen, my flashlight beam trembling slightly. I didn't dare call out. The silence in the house felt suddenly heavy, suffocating. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get back into Sarah's room. I slowly backed away from the open door, my eyes fixed on that sliver of black. I felt like something was watching me from inside that room, a cold, unseen gaze. I fumbled for the doorknob to Sarah's room, my fingers clumsy. It wouldn't turn. I tried again, twisting harder. Locked. From the outside. Panic flared in my chest. Sarah's parents always locked her door from the outside when they went to bed. We had slipped out when it was locked, but now, with me outside and the door shut, I was trapped in the hall. And then, I heard the faint, rhythmic dragging sound again, this time from inside her parents' room, closer, more distinct. I spent the rest of the night pressed against the wall opposite Sarah's parents' door, clutching the flashlight, too terrified to move or even breathe loudly. I watched that crack in their door for hours, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Nothing did. The dragging sound stopped after a few minutes, replaced by an unnerving silence. I must have drifted off because the next thing I knew, sunlight was streaming through the windows at the end of the hall. Sarah's dad's voice boomed from downstairs, calling for breakfast. I bolted to Sarah's door, fumbling with the knob. This time, it turned. It was unlocked. I burst in, startling Sarah, who was still asleep. I tried to explain what had happened, my voice shaky, but Sarah just looked at me like I was crazy. She swore she hadn't gotten up. Her parents were perfectly normal at breakfast, completely oblivious. And the truly terrifying part? Every single internal door in their house, including Sarah's bedroom door, had a locking mechanism that required a key to lock it from the outside. A key that was always kept on a hook right by the front door. We checked. The key was there, right where it always was. Meaning someone would have had to go all the way downstairs, get the key, lock her door, put the key back, and then go back upstairs. No one had. I've gone over that night 1,000 times, and I still can't find a logical explanation for any of it. Who opened her parents' door? What made those dragging sounds? And most chillingly, who locked me out of Sarah's room when the key was downstairs, and then unlocked it before morning? Sarah still thinks I had a vivid nightmare, or that maybe I was just tired and misremembered everything. But I know what I heard, and I know what I saw. I haven't had a sleepover at her house since, and I don't think I ever will. The thought of that open door, that sound, and the chilling realization that someone was moving around that house, knowing I was there, still gives me nightmares. Every reflection shows you, or at least, what you expect to see. A familiar face, a recognizable form. But what if the image staring back isn't quite right? What if it knows something you don't? What if it's not a reflection at all, but something else entirely, waiting for its chance to step through? The small lamp on my friend Sarah's nightstand was unplugged, even though we'd used it just an hour before to read through old yearbooks. I remembered specifically plugging it in because the outlet was behind her bed and a pain to reach. It was a detail that kept nagging at me later, long after everything else. I was 15 at the time, and Sarah had invited me over for a sleepover, mostly to binge-watch terrible horror movies and eat an entire pizza. Her parents were out of town, leaving us with the whole house to ourselves, which felt like the ultimate freedom. We'd set up our sleeping bags on the floor of her living room, right in front of the big screen TV, surrounded by blankets and pillows, ready for a night of harmless scares and giggles. The air was thick with the scent of microwaved popcorn and cheap nail polish, a perfectly normal Friday night. The first movie, some zombie flick, was loud and campy. We were yelling at the screen, throwing popcorn, completely absorbed. But by the second movie, a more psychological thriller, the mood had shifted. We were quieter, huddled closer under the blankets. The house, usually bustling with Sarah's younger siblings and her parents' constant activity, felt strangely large and silent around us. Every creak of the old floorboards, every rustle of leaves against the windows, seemed amplified. It wasn't a scary quiet, not yet, just noticeable. Sarah's dog, a lazy beagle named Buster, was usually underfoot, begging for scraps, but he was nowhere to be seen. Sarah mentioned he was probably asleep in her parents' room, which made sense, but still added to the unusual stillness. Around 1 a.m., during a particularly tense scene in the movie, the hallway light just outside the living room flickered. Not a slow dim, but a quick, sharp blink, like a faulty bulb. We both jumped. "Did you see that?" Sarah whispered, her eyes wide. I nodded, my heart already doing a little flutter. "Just the old wiring, probably," I tried to reassure her, and myself. Sarah's house was pretty old, built in the 70s, and things like that weren't entirely uncommon. Still, it had never happened while I was there before. We paused the movie, listening. The house was utterly silent again, save for the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. We waited, but the light stayed steady after that. We shrugged it off, attributing it to our overactive imaginations, fueled by the movie and the late hour. About 20 minutes later, a distinct thud came from upstairs. It sounded like something heavy had been dropped. Sarah and I froze. Buster was definitely upstairs now, I thought. "Buster," Sarah mouthed, a little too loudly. We both listened intently. Then, faint footsteps, slow and deliberate, started moving across the floor directly above us, in Sarah's parents' bedroom. They were too heavy for Buster. My blood ran cold. Sarah grabbed my arm, her grip tight. "Mom and Dad aren't home," she whispered, her voice barely audible. We looked at each other, the same terrified question in our eyes. Who was upstairs? We tried to rationalize it again. Maybe her younger brother had snuck back in? But he was supposed to be at a friend's house for the weekend. The footsteps continued, pacing back and forth, a slow, rhythmic drag. We lay there, terrified, for what felt like an eternity. The pacing eventually stopped, replaced by an unsettling silence. Sarah pointed a trembling finger at her phone. "Call the police," she mouthed. I nodded, fumbling with my phone, my hands shaking so badly I could barely unlock it. But then, a new sound. The distinct click of the front door, closing. It wasn't the sound of someone opening it, but specifically closing it, as if someone had just left. We exchanged a look of pure confusion, mixed with relief. Had someone been there and just left? We waited a few more minutes, too scared to move, before Sarah finally whispered, "Maybe we should check the door?" We crept to the front door, heartbeats hammering. It was unlocked. And the deadbolt, which Sarah always locked, was also disengaged. We quickly secured it, our minds racing. After locking the door, we both needed to use the bathroom. We went together, too scared to be alone. The bathroom was just off the living room. Sarah went first, while I waited outside the door, my ears straining for any other sound in the house. When she came out, her face was pale. Did you mess with the mirror?" she asked, her voice tight. I frowned. "No, why would I?" She gestured back into the bathroom. Reluctantly, I stepped inside. The mirror above the sink, which had been perfectly clean earlier, was fogged up. And on the condensation, clearly written, were the letters H.I. Not drawn with a finger, but somehow, pressed in. Like someone had leaned their face against it, hard enough to leave an impression, and then wiped just enough to leave those two letters visible. My breath hitched. It was a detail I knew with absolute certainty hadn't been there before. We ran back to the living room, our relief from earlier completely vanished. Sarah was hyperventilating. Someone was here, inside the house, while we were here, she whispered frantically. My mind was racing, trying to put the pieces together. The unplugged lamp, the flickering light, the footsteps, the door, the mirror, it all clicked into place in a horrifying mosaic. Sarah grabbed her phone, scrolling through her camera roll. She often took silly photos during sleepovers. She found one from just an hour ago, a blurry selfie of us making funny faces in the living room. In the background, barely visible in the dark reflection of the TV screen, was a faint, distorted shape. It was too blurry to make out details, but it looked like a face. A face that wasn't ours. And it looked like it was looking directly at us, from behind. We didn't call the police. We called Sarah's aunt, who lived 10 minutes away, and pretended there was a spider as big as a dinner plate. Her aunt arrived quickly, looking annoyed, but when she saw our terrified faces, her expression softened. We told her everything, leaving out the mirror message because it sounded too unbelievable. Her aunt checked the house, finding nothing amiss, but she insisted we sleep at her place for the night. We left Sarah's house in a daze, the eerie silence of it seeming to follow us. As we were about to leave, Sarah's aunt, shining a flashlight under the living room couch, spotted something. It was Buster, Sarah's beagle, curled up in a tight ball, trembling. He usually slept anywhere but under the couch. He wouldn't come out, not even for Sarah, until her aunt practically dragged him. He whimpered the whole way to the car. We stayed at Sarah's aunt's house for the rest of the weekend. Sarah's parents came home the next day, and we told them the story. They called the police, who found no signs of forced entry, no broken windows, nothing. They suggested it was probably just a prank by some local kids, or maybe a misunderstanding, but the fear in their eyes told us they knew it was more than that. I still remember the look on Sarah's dad's face as he walked through the house, his eyes scanning every shadow. The whole experience left a deep mark. To this day, I can't look at a dark reflection without a shiver. And I always make sure every door in my house is not just locked, but double locked, the deadbolt thrown, because you never know who might be watching, or who might have already been inside, just waiting for you to notice their reflection. These are the shadows we carry, the whispers that follow us from the edge of the known. They remind us that the most profound horrors aren't always monsters in the dark, but the quiet unsettling of what we thought was real, the slow erosion of our certainty. They linger because they tap into a fear we all share, the fragile barrier between our safe world and the unknown. They stay with us because they could happen to anyone, anywhere, even to you. If you're brave enough to explore more of these unsettling tales, consider subscribing for a new story every week.